Cardinal Pierbattista Pizzaballa, the Catholic Patriarch of Jerusalem, was on his way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the Christian quarter of Jerusalem's Old City on Palm Sunday 2026, when Israeli forces stopped him. Israeli police cited safety concerns due to Iranian missile attacks, debris from which caused damage in the area.
Some Palestinians and activists viewed this, however, as an attempt to tighten Israeli control in the area. And some Palestinian Christians thought that the cardinal, instead of complying with the guards, should have forced his way through, and that church authorities have been too lenient with Israel in general, and too neglectful of the plight of the Palestinian people.
The geopolitics are complex and tangled up in religious history. The ancient city of Jerusalem, originally founded by the Jewish people, now plays a key role in the tradition and worship of Christianity and Islam as well as Judaism. So Catholic leaders in what we routinely call the Holy Land have long had to walk a delicate line.
The situation has become even more challenging since October 7th, 2023, when militant groups carried out a series of attacks on Jewish Israelis during the Jewish holiday of Simchat Torah. In response, Israel launched a large-scale military operation in Gaza, which has escalated into a humanitarian disaster that some are terming a genocide.
Various activists and justice groups criticize the United States and many Christian congregations' decades-long support of Israel. Meanwhile, both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are once again on the rise.
In response to this complex, painful, and highly charged conflict, Catholics might be inclined to remain silent, especially given the Church's history of oppressing both Jews and Muslims. But does the Church have any kind of official statement on the conflict in Gaza? Is there a correct Catholic response? That's what we're going to discuss on this episode of the podcast.
Welcome to Glad You Asked, where we answer the questions about Catholicism that are easy to ask, but not so easy to answer.
Hi, Rebecca. How are you?
I am gearing myself up for a conversation about a topic that I have strong but complicated feelings on. How are you?
Yeah, just to be perfectly honest, right, like this is a topic that I am sometimes afraid to make missteps on. I think like a lot of Catholics, right? I have people I know who are observant Jews who have lived in Israel. I have people I know who are Muslim. I have friends who are activists who feel really strongly about what's going on in Palestine right now. And I think, like a lot of people, I am worried about making a misstep. And that's why I'm really glad that we're having this conversation today. I'm really glad that the guests who we'll introduce shortly are writing the book that they are, because I think this sort of resource and this sort of guide and kind of pointing out where that fear and discomfort comes from, especially for Catholics, is really important. And I think this is a really worthwhile conversation.
Yeah, that fear of making a misstep, that's so relatable. And I have family in Israel. I grew up celebrating rituals in which we said next year in Jerusalem. Israel has a very strong role that it has played in my religious and spiritual life and my sense of identity. And I think that's the case for many Jewish people, even if we're just ethnic Jews and not practicing. At the same time, I feel that I've frequently been in spaces where there's been this kind of strange way of talking about Israel that's very apocalyptically charged and associated with a real indifference to the people of Palestine, and encountering so much just, again, indifference or even dehumanization of the Palestinian people in Christian and in other spaces has been very alarming. So I think the conversation we're going to have will help us as people who feel strongly about human rights and human dignity and want to take seriously the appeals of many different people.
I also think that it's important to note that there is this mythology around Israel as a country in America specifically, and that we receive all of these messages around what Israel is, Israel's relationship to Christianity and to America, like that are really hard to parse and sort out. And we're not going to get into that in this conversation, but I do also think that that's part of what a lot of American Catholics, American Christians are struggling with, is to kind of unpack that history and that legacy a little bit too.
That's very accurate. I mean, I see signs saying I support Israel all over the place, and yet I know that the people who are putting the signs up do not have my shared perspective on the way of framing the dignity of Jews in Israel or Palestinians in the region, and it's awkward and strange. And I sometimes want to say, no, please, we don't want that kind of support.
So on this episode of the podcast, we're going to start to unpack some of these things and talk about how Catholics can respond to the conflict in Gaza. I'm Emily Santa, one of the hosts of Glad You Asked.
And I'm Rebecca Bratton-Weiss. Before we get into the interview, let's take a moment to thank our sponsors.
This episode is sponsored in part by Catholic Relief Services. In times of crisis, the Church is called to respond with compassion and hope. In Gaza and beyond, Catholic Relief Services works with the local church and trusted partners, serving communities of all faiths with compassion and care. Learn more at crs.org.
This episode is also sponsored by the USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries, who tend to the religious and pastoral needs of vulnerable communities. As part of a global congregation of Catholic priests and brothers, Claretians uplift the dignity of all people, especially those who feel overlooked or forgotten. To find out more and get involved, please visit www.claretians.org.
Now back to today's question. How should Catholics respond to the conflict in Gaza? To answer this question, we talked to Jordan Denari Duffner and Julie Shoemaker-Cohen, co-authors of the book Palestine, Israel, and Catholic Social Teaching, forthcoming from Orbis Books later this fall.
Denari Duffner is a Catholic theologian, author, and professor whose work centers on Muslim-Christian relations, interreligious dialogue, Islamophobia, and Israel-Palestine. And Shoemaker-Cohen is a doctoral candidate in political science at Temple University who focuses on religion and politics and has long been involved in Israel-Palestine peacebuilding and advocacy. Hi, Jordan and Julie. I'm so glad you could join us on the podcast today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So the two of you are writing a book together about Palestine, right? What brought you together to advocate on the conflict in Israel and Palestine?
Well, we are both members of the Catholic Advisory Council of Churches for Middle East Peace. So we met a couple of years ago in our advocacy work through that. Both of us obviously have our own journeys to how we, began working on Israel-Palestine. For me, it's personal. It's time spent in Palestine, Israel, the people that I met along the way, especially Palestinian Christians. So I am Catholic. I'm the daughter of an Israeli. So I have Jewish Israeli family in Tel Aviv on my mother's side. And growing up, I saw a lot of what was unfolding in the region through kind of an American Christian Israeli lens. And I think that that is a lens that's similar to many Americans, where I didn't really have a reference point for the Palestinian experience. I studied abroad in the fall of 2000, which really was a transformational kind of time for me. I was living and studying in East Jerusalem. I was volunteering in the West Bank. And I was taking a class on Palestinian society and politics. And through that, had a wonderful professor, Dr. Bernard Sabella, who is a Palestinian Catholic sociologist. And so the friendship and the encouragement from him as my professor was especially transformative. And so all of that kind of converged. It was also the fall of 2000 was when the Oslo peace process was breaking down. The Second Intifada was starting. And so I was learning a lot and also unlearning a lot of kind of biases and misconceptions that I had. And so I would end up working for Churches for Middle East Peace after college, which is a coalition of, Christian organizations. And I did a lot of their legislative advocacy work. I then moved to Scranton, and I do local community engagement at the Jesuit University of Scranton, but I've stayed engaged on Israel-Palestine. And then a few years ago, Father Drew Christensen, a wonderful Jesuit who has passed away, who was a wonderful leader on Israel Palestine among the U.S. Jesuits, recruited both Jordan and I to join the Catholic Advisory Council. So yeah, so that's how we met, and it's been a wonderful partnership. And of course, now we're writing the book together that will be coming out this fall.
I'll say just a little bit about my journey. My work is mainly in Muslim-Christian relations, but Israel-Palestine was always showing up and kind of butting up against that work. When I was in undergrad, I studied the history of Israel-Palestine, and it was, a constant feature of my education. But it was really once I visited the region and started seeing the injustices firsthand that this became something that I was really concerned about and developed a personal passion for. I studied abroad during college in Amman, Jordan, on the other side of the Jordan River. And the first time I visited Israel-Palestine was during Holy Week. And so it was really moving to be going to these holy sites during the time where we remember the events that happened in those places. But at the same time, I was also seeing firsthand the injustices that I had read about. And during that time, I was also meeting Palestinians, not just in Israel, Palestine, but also in Jordan, because Jordan has a large Palestinian refugee community. And even the host family that I was living with, who were Jordanian Catholics, had Palestinian family background and history. So I made a number of subsequent trips to Israel, Palestine. And it was after my most recent trip in 2020, weeks before the pandemic began, that I really realized that I needed to start writing and advocating about this publicly. I think for a long time I had thought, well, I've seen this, but I'm not going to talk about it. And again, that sort of changed in 2020, 2021. And then shortly thereafter, teamed up with Julie, became a part of the Catholic Advisory Council. And we were doing this work before October 7th and the genocide in Gaza began. But obviously the work has ramped up considerably since then.
So for our listeners who may not be familiar with the details of the history, could you give a brief, if that's possible, outline of how the conflict got started and how it's evolved over the years?
Yeah, so this is tough. Brief is tough, but we do spend time in the book, in the introduction, providing a historical overview, because we do think it's really important. So I think it's an important question. And many of the injustices that we see today really do stem from historical events. So I will try to do a kind of brief overview, but it does, of course, take us back to the early 20th century in the Holy Land, which is at that time known as historic Palestine. It's ruled by the Ottoman Empire. There is a majority Palestinian Arab population, Christians and Muslims, and a Jewish minority. And at the same time, in Europe, anti-Semitism is rising, and European Jews are beginning to formulate what will become known as the movement known as Zionism, to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. In 1917, that's a really important kind of milestone, the British Balfour Declaration, which promises Jews a national home in Palestine. When you read the language in the declaration, you see that it only in passing refers to non-Jews. So Palestinians are not even named, and they were not consulted on that declaration. And that's a theme in a lot of that, early history really throughout the 20th century. There's also an important Zionist slogan, and that was something that I also did a lot of studying in that same fall of 2000, looking at kind of Zionist and Israeli history, but the slogan of a land without a people for a people without a land. So thinking again that were there no people in that land? Of course, there were people, and that's ignoring and erasing the Palestinian experience. Fast forward a little bit to 1947, the UN partition plan. We're seeing the call for a Jewish state on 56% of the land, even though Palestine's majority population is still the Arab, Palestinian majority. Then in 1948, when Israel declares independence, a war ensues in that process. And we know that many Catholics are not as familiar with the Nakba, which is the Arabic word for catastrophe, when Palestinians are forcibly displaced, 750,000, to make way for the establishment of Israel. And by the end of that war, Israel takes control of 78% of historic Palestine. So on the one hand, in 1948, you have the Jews gaining a safe haven and a state in the wake of the Holocaust, but at the same time, Palestinians are experiencing dispossession. And that historic injustice is really one that has remained unrepaired, because we know to this day, Palestinians are still stateless and do not have freedom. And so again, fast forward to 1967, there's another war, and Israel occupies the remaining territory, and that's the last 22% of the land. That's the Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and also begins moving Jewish, Israeli Jews into the West Bank as settlers, which is a violation of international law. The Oslo peace process is a kind of hopeful moment in 1993. And I mentioned again, 2000, it begins to unravel, but that's when the Palestinian Authority is formed. Unfortunately, and there's hope that that will culminate in Palestinian statehood, but that does not happen. And the PA is never really empowered to secure Palestinian rights. So we see a lot of that unraveling. And also in 2005, there's Palestinian elections where the Islamist party of Hamas comes to power in Gaza. And we see, and after that, there is the blockade of Gaza. So again, as Jordan talked about, things didn't start on October 7th. There was already in Gaza, for instance, a blockade that many Gazans would refer to, their territory as kind of an open air prison. And then, of course, yes, in the last 2 years, we get to the fateful day of October 7th, the terrible attack by Hamas on southern Israel, and then Israel's ensuing Gaza genocide. But we think it is important to go back and look at these historical developments, and we do more detail in the book because all throughout that we see this kind of pattern in which one group has more rights than the other. And to this day, wherever Palestinians are in Israel, Palestine, they have fewer rights than Jewish Israelis, and that's something that we talk about in the book.
So why should Catholics advocate around what's going on in Israel, Palestine? What parts of Catholic social teaching are important to understand what's going on? What makes this something that we should all be engaged in and not something that is happening between Muslim and Jewish people continents away from us?
Yeah, this is a really important question. I think, like you rightly say, there's this maybe implicit feeling that a lot of Catholics and American Catholics have that this is an issue that doesn't affect us. This is about people who are far away and involves religious traditions that we're not a part of. But I think that is an unfortunate view for a couple of reasons. And we really do make the case that this, advocating for justice and peace in Palestine is a Catholic cause and a Catholic issue. I think first and foremost because there are Christians and Catholics in the Holy Land, predominantly Palestinian. Many people don't know, they're not aware that there are not just Palestinian Muslims, but there are also Palestinian Catholics and Christians. Now, they're a very small part of the population, but they, I think, have an outsized role in the society and in the consciousness of the community. The church is also very present in the Holy Land, not just with the holy sites, but the Vatican and Catholic ministries have long been intent on supporting the Christian community and the holy sites in the region. So there is the presence of the church in the Holy Land. I think that's first and foremost. Now, even if there weren't Palestinian Christians, even if the church weren't present, I think we as Catholics would still have an obligation arising from our faith commitments to include this cause among the others that we as Catholics care about. And so this is what our work in our book is about, looking at how Catholic social teaching applies to this issue, how it not only helps us understand the injustices. I think CST is a really great lens for looking at these problems, but then also to envision and then discern our own role and how we can alleviate the harm, how we can stand in solidarity with all those pushing for justice, peace, and equality. And American Catholics, US Catholics have a particular role here because our government is very much involved and complicit in the harms that have been committed both today and historically. If we think about just the past couple of years, the United States has continued to provide weapons to Israel, even amid the genocide in Gaza, or give diplomatic cover while Israel is, engaging in policies that dispossess and harm Palestinians. And we do have a lot of elected leaders in the United States who are Catholic. We think about President Joe Biden, our second Catholic president, who, from our perspective, seemed to forget some of these principles of Catholic social teaching in how he dealt with the situation abroad. And then now we have a number of major Catholic figures in the administration, the vice president, the secretary of state. And so I think we as Catholics, as lay Catholics, and those of us who are not in positions of political power, we have to recognize that we can't sit on the sidelines, and we have a unique opportunity to appeal to the shared faith tradition that we have with our leaders and to also engage on this issue. And I'll let Julie talk a little bit more about the principles of Catholic social teaching and how they apply.
Yeah, so as we know, sometimes people refer to Catholic social teaching as the best kept secret, and I think in this case of applying it to Israel Palestine, it is just really really helpful. And so we actually organized a book around some of the core principles in terms of the chapters, and I'll just touch on sort of the main ones that we work through in the book. So first and foremost, of course, we have to be grounded in the fundamental human dignity of the person, seeing the image of God in Palestinians and Israelis, and I think that this really helps us to reject dehumanization of any kind, including in our advocacy, but especially in terms of what's happening on the ground in Israel, Palestine. And then flowing from that care for the inherent dignity of all, it brings us to the preferential option for the poor and the vulnerable, which really calls us to draw close to where the suffering is most acute, to go to the margins, to identify also systemic injustices. And we know that many people were impacted by seeing what was happening in Gaza on the ground, on their phones. And then being impacted by seeing Pope Francis making those calls every night to the church, the Holy Family Catholic Church in Gaza. And so what a model he was for us in terms of, again, holding those two principles together. We also talk in the book about pursuit of the common good, so seeking solutions that prioritize equality, justice, and peace for all people, for the 7 million Jewish Israelis, the 7 million Palestinians who need to share that land and live in that land with equality. And then subsidiarity and solidarity, because they also really inform, again, our behaviors and how we engage in this work. And solidarity, we know, calls us to the work of accompaniment. So we are very inspired by Palestinian and Israeli human rights and peace activists who are working on the ground. And then again, as Catholics, walking with our Palestinian Christian sisters and brothers. And then subsidiarity, again, connected, is how do we listen and hear from those who are most affected by, again, what is happening on the ground. And many may be familiar with, Palestinian Christians often talk about or ask us to come and see what's happening. And then as a result of that, to go and tell and kind of, again, do that advocacy here in the United States, which is so important. Not everybody's going to be able to make a trip to Israel, Palestine. So part of what we do in the book is to share stories, to bring voices, to talk about the experiences that we've had, and hopefully help people to take that journey a little bit and become humane, effective, prophetic advocates using Catholic social teaching as a tool.
Some of the reluctance of Christians to speak out about the situation in Gaza seems to come from what I consider to be a legitimate sense of guilt or concern, at least, over historical Christian anti-Semitism and just the extent to which the Catholic Church was complicit in that. How should Catholics reckon with that history when approaching this contemporary issue?
So I have thought a lot about that, and I've written on this topic. And absolutely, you're right that Christians have legitimate feelings of guilt around historic anti-Semitism, which contributed to the Holocaust, and to really understand and know the history in terms of Christians and churches' roles in that. And we think of the Vatican public silence or the German Catholic complicity in Nazism. But then we have to really think about and discern about how is that handled. And in many cases, I think that feeling of guilt is misdirected in the case of Israel Palestine because it leads to silence around what's happening in Palestine and unconditional support for Israel as kind of a way to make up for that. And we're very clear that, Palestinians were not the perpetrators of the Holocaust, and they should not be the ones to suffer for the West's anti-Semitism. So we cannot, as Catholics or as Christians, repair our relationship with Jews at the expense of Palestinians who have experienced Zionism as subjugation and dispossession and discrimination. And also understanding that our responsibilities, we have multiple responsibilities to the well-being and flourishing of both Jews and Palestinians. So that those feelings should not lead us to kind of abandon the Palestinian people, because also if we do that, we're kind of repeating the same mistake that we would have done before. And we can think back to when Pope Francis in the fall of 2024 talked about the importance of investigations into whether Israel's military assault amounted to genocide in Gaza. And some Catholic observers at the time pointed to this, saying he was trying to ensure, in a way, that the church was not silent in the face of these grave injustices. So again, I think we have models. We need to hold these things together to reject anti-Semitism and to very much see that we can do that at the same time as we uphold the human rights and dignity of Palestinians and push for Palestinian freedom and for the mutual flourishing of both Palestinians and Israelis.
So on the other hand, criticism of the actions of Hamas is often perceived as Islamophobia or a lack of care for Palestinians. So it seems like there's this increasingly narrow space between anti-Semitism on one hand and Islamophobia on the other. Is that kind of a fair framing for some of like what's going on in public discourse right now?
So as somebody who studies Islamophobia in some of my other work, I want to be clear that it's not anti-Muslim or it's not Islamophobic to criticize the war crimes or the atrocities committed by any group, including Hamas. I think one of the things that Catholic social teaching really helps us do is to identify harms that are committed by any group, while then also not falling into any kind of collective blame or collective punishment of a population who shares the identity of individuals or groups who perpetrate acts of violence. So again, it's really important, I think, to say that it is not Islamophobic to criticize atrocities committed by Hamas or other groups that participated on October 7th, just as it's not anti-Semitic to critique or oppose Israel's actions in Gaza or ideologies of Zionism. Again, the issue is when we take that too far and say, okay, well, now I'm going to blame all Jews, or I'm going to blame all Muslims, or I'm going to blame all Palestinians. Because this kind of thinking has led to further violence here in the United States, people attacking Palestinians because they associate them with what Hamas did on October 7th. And one awful and tragic example of this was just a week after October 7th outside Chicago, where a little 6-year-old boy named Wadi al-Fayoumi, a Palestinian American Muslim boy whose parents had actually left the West Bank because of the oppression they were facing there, came to the United States only to have their son killed by their landlord, who was a Catholic, because he associated this little boy and his family with what happened on October 7th. I mean, that is just horrific. We've also seen many cases and trends of people attacking Jewish Americans because they hold them responsible for Israel's actions. So all of this has to be rejected. I think we also have to resist falling into stereotypical talking points when talking about Israel-Palestine. And so one of the things that we do in our work is try to remind people of these are the common anti-Muslim tropes, these are the common anti-Jewish tropes, and not apply them when we're talking about Israel-Palestine, because again, that can be really harmful. I also think it's really helpful, rather than pitting Islamophobia and anti-Semitism against each other, to remember that, especially in the West, these two forms of bigotry are very much related. They emerge out of the history of Christian Europe and Christians marginalizing or otherizing both Jews and Muslims and applying the same stereotypes to them. So I think, again, it can be easy sometimes for Christians to be like, oh, Jews are being universally Islamophobic, Muslims are being universally anti-Semitic. That's not what's happening. I think sometimes our religious traditions get invoked in negative ways, and sometimes there are patterns of otherization, but Christians are doing that a lot too, as in the case with Wadi al-Fayoumi. And, what I see is, it doesn't get a lot of airtime, it doesn't get a lot of attention, but there are Jews, Christians, and Muslims on the same proverbial side, pushing for the same outcomes of justice, peace, and equality during the genocide in Gaza, pushing for a ceasefire, pushing for the release of Israeli hostages, pushing for the release of Palestinian political prisoners, humanitarian aid, halt on U.S. offensive weapons. So I think rather than kind of fall into this framing of it being a religious conflict or a religious war, we have to really foreground our principles and then ally with all of those who share those values.
How would you assess the institutional church's response to this conflict? Have you noticed any changes, especially in the approach between the Francis and the Leo papacies?
So as Julie mentioned earlier, I think Pope Francis was a prophetic moral voice who exemplified these CST principles and showed us how you can hold them together. Julie mentioned how he called the parish in Gaza every night. And I think that practice was a beautiful expression of solidarity. And Pope Francis also, just kind of emerging from his personality, often spoke off the cuff. He spoke in very kind of emphatic and straightforward ways. Leo has a different personality and a different way of speaking. So I think in certain ways he has certainly carried forward Pope Francis's approach and the ability to hold together these different principles of Catholic social teaching and how he's addressing this, but the style is different. And I also do think that Leo is an American like us. And so he might also be coming out of some of the framing that that we also grew up with and had to unlearn, sort of this framing of the issue sometimes as two sides that are in conflict with maybe not so much an attention to the power differential. Now, I do think Leo's aware of all of this, but I think sometimes if it's not spoken to explicitly or clearly, an American audience can kind of be left with some of their stereotypes about the region still intact. I think Catholic leaders in the U.S. could have done more, could have spoken out more. Many of them did. We had a number of bishops and other leaders who spoke out forcefully, but there was a bit of a void or a vacuum. And yet, I think a lot of lay Catholics, and we were in touch with many of them, had this desire to engage more directly on this issue, or maybe engage it for the first time. And so one of the things that we did was put together what we called the U.S. Catholic sign-on letter on Israel-Palestine. And this was back in 2024, where we called for some of these policy positions that I mentioned before: ceasefire, release of hostages, things like that. And I think this was a beautiful example of Catholics across the spectrum, not just at the highest levels of the hierarchy, leaning into our leadership and our moral voice and saying, this is what we believe in, and this is what our values compel us to advocate for. And one of the things I always like to draw attention to with the letter is we had 6,000 signatories of the letter, many of them, thousands of them leaders. 2,000 of them, a third of the signers of the letter, were American sisters, women religious. And that just speaks to, again, just the backbone that sisters are in the American church and their prophetic voice.
So officially, the Catholic Church supports and has advocated for a two-state solution in Israel and Palestine. First of all, can you talk a little bit about what that means? Because I think it's become a political jargon term that is thrown around. But also, do you think that this approach will be the most effective to ending the conflict?
Yes. So a two-state solution, just very simply, would mean that there would be a independent and sovereign Palestinian state alongside Israel. And when we talk about the occupied territories, so Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem would comprise the Palestinian state, and there would be some kind of a sharing of Jerusalem. I think the question and sort of the skepticism at this point in 2026 around the two-state solution is because of whether it is actually feasible or possible. Any of us who have traveled in the West Bank have seen up close the Israeli settlements, the infrastructure around them, settler-only roads, taking of water resources, checkpoints, and especially since October 7th, we hear all the time from our Palestinian colleagues about how the freedom of movement has become so much worse. There are actually gates and checkpoints that keep people from even leaving their villages and towns. So there is quite a bit of a sense of, is a two-state solution even possible, at this point? The Catholic Church position officially is that supporting a two-state outcome. And that's really important because we know that affirms the need for Palestinian freedom and self-determination alongside Jewish Israelis, that both peoples should have equality and dignity in that land. In the book, we talk in the chapter around the pursuit of the common good about potential political solutions and what these could look like. And so the two-state solution, but also really listening to voices on the ground, Palestinian Christians and Catholic leaders in the Holy Land who have talked a lot about whatever the solution might be, whether it is a two-state solution, a confederation. There's a wonderful work being done around a group called A Land for All, and then a binational one state or a democratic one state. Whichever of these solutions is what is going to come to pass, they prioritize equality. So basically, we need to have equality between Jewish Israelis, and Palestinians. And one of the problems also with a two-state solution, or would need to be resolved, in addition to the Palestinian state being contiguous, independent, and sovereign, is the status of Palestinian citizens of Israel. Because currently there are many discriminatory laws within Israel such that Palestinians are kind of second-class citizens within Israel, and also resolving issues like the right of Palestinian refugees to return. So all of those things need to be resolved to have a truly just outcome that could, I think, finally bring the kind of peace and justice and equality that we all want to see in Israel-Palestine.
So we always end these conversations by asking our guests if our audience takes away just one insight from the conversation they've just listened to, what would you want it to be?
So we give a lot of suggestions of things that people can do in our work and in our book. But to be brief about it, I think first and foremost is to stay informed and not to look away. I think it's vital that we listen to and uplift the experiences of those in the region, especially Palestinians and Palestinian Christians whose voices are often not heard in mainstream US media. So continue hosting events, attending educational events, and then also engaging in advocacy, pushing for just policies, reaching out to our elected officials here in the United States. I think sometimes, especially now, that seems kind of futile. What mechanisms do we have to actually push for a change in US policy? But I think that's still important. And in the meantime, supporting Palestinian businesses, contributing to the economic life of Palestinians, which is really, really, really struggling, especially in the last 2.5 years, donating to humanitarian organizations. And then there are other advocacy measures like boycotting companies that are complicit in genocide and violence and occupation, and divesting from weapons manufacturers and arms companies. So I could go on and on with different things that Catholics can engage in. But what's wonderful about Catholic social teaching is it gives us these principles and these tools to discern what our individual and collective role should be as Catholics.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think that I see sometimes a kind of temptation among some Catholics or Christian advocates to kind of engage in a sort of both sidesism, or feel that maybe we have to be neutral on Israel-Palestine because it feels complex or difficult or even controversial. And I think that Catholic social teaching can really help us see a way out of that, again, to uphold the fundamental human dignity of Palestinians and Israelis, but to really be focused also on the disparities, on the power differentials, and the systemic and structural injustices that we see in the occupation, in what's also been deemed a genocide, an apartheid system in Israel-Palestine, and then in the genocide in Gaza. And one quote that we really like to share, and also just thinking about voices to listen to, Father David Neuhaus, an Israeli Jesuit, is a wonderful resource. He writes and speaks a lot. And then Latin Patriarch Michel Sabah, who was the first Palestinian patriarch, I think, in many centuries. We don't know the exact date, but he's the emeritus leader of the Catholic Church and another wonderful inspiration. And he wrote in the fall of 2024 he said, "We must actively take sides, the side of justice and peace, freedom and equality. We need to have the international community must help us recognize the root cause of this war is the negation of the right of the Palestinian people to live in its land free and equal." And he said we have to stand alongside all those Muslim, Jews, and Christians who are seeking to put an end to this. So I think as much as this can feel like a difficult issue to engage in or feel futile, it's not. And we have a role to play as Catholics. We can take the side of justice and peace, and we can see a future that I think where there can be justice and peace and equality for Palestinians and Israelis. And again, we hope that the book will be a guide and a kind of blueprint for Catholics to engage on Israel-Palestine.
Well, thank you so much, Julie and Jordan, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Emily, I have to admit, I always approach this topic with trepidation, even though I knew going in that both the people we were talking to come at the topic with a deeply informed perspective and really great moral understanding. I still had some trepidation, but I think that was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, I agree. Was there anything that surprised you that they talked about?
I think I'd like to note that what I appreciated in this case was their acknowledgement of American distractedness. And that seems to be something that has become much more pronounced just in the past few years. I don't know how much social media has to do with this, how much deliberate disinformation and social engineering have to do with it, or if it's simply a reaction to just the exhausting news cycle where it seems like there's so much bad stuff going on and nothing we can do about it, and we want to go hide until it affects us. So how about you?
I appreciated the reframing of kind of unconditional support for Israel as being this redirection for Christian guilt over historic anti-Semitism. We talked in the beginning of that there's this that there's this narrative about Israel that has gotten passed down as part of kind of how American Christians understand themselves. And I think that kind of helped to reframe like why that narrative exists. Sometimes, some ways, I don't think in all ways, but I also felt like it made me a little more sympathetic, um, a little more sympathetic towards people who express that kind of unconditional support for Israel. Made me understand it a little bit more, and I hope that people kind of sit in that place, because it was kind of an uncomfortable like realization, I think, for some people to hear or listen to, and I hope our listeners kind of sit in that a little bit.
I hope so too. I mean, I've commented before to some of my friends who, like me, are ethnically Jewish, and who support a two-state solution. I've commented before that sometimes having this conversation reminds me of having conversations about the pro-life issue 10 years ago, where it felt as though there was only one or the other perspective you could come down on, and there was going to be a lot of really cruel discourse from people if you didn't ascribe exactly to the view that they wanted. And being able to sit with that discomfort seems really important. Something I've often thought about is that there is a lot of guilt over the Holocaust and historic anti-Semitism, which goes back for centuries. And it's not like the Holocaust just came out of the blue. And unconditional support of Israel just seems like not the right way to deal with that. It's almost like there's a refusal to acknowledge Western complicity and Christian complicity. So instead of saying, okay, wait, we did a bad thing for a long time, we're going to pretend like we don't really need to address that, and instead be like, okay, unconditional support for Israel. Or alternatively, unconditional rejection of Israel is sometimes the alternative.
Yes. I think that as Americans, we are all, no matter what our political party, we're all very used to the idea that you can love your country or your identity and firmly disagree with what your government is doing in the name of your country. And I feel like we haven't quite figured out how to extend that, sitting in that the complicated nature of that, to Israel. That you can be Jewish, you can love Israel, you can love your homeland, and still firmly disagree with the things your government is doing. And I don't know if we figured out how to do it for ourselves. I don't know why we can't like translate it to others. But there does seem to be, like you said, in both directions, like either unconditional support for Israel or unconditional kind of condemnation of Israel.
I think there's also the fact that here in the United States, we are living on land that was stolen. And I remember once when I was working in the garden and one of my kids was with me, and he dug up an arrowhead. And it really brought home to me the fact that we are gardening and connecting and living off of land that belonged to other people who were forcibly removed. And if I were to say to my fellow progressive Americans, okay, you're on stolen land, time to move now, you got to go, they would say, but wait, we can't do this. And yet we seem to have this expectation that a complicated situation in Israel can be resolved in that way. But then on the flip side, there's just such a wide disregard for the horrors that are being inflicted on the people of Gaza. It's almost like, depending on which room I'm in, I'm going to be arguing vehemently either for the humanity of Jewish people or the humanity of anyone who seems to be Muslim, because many Palestinians are Christians. And yet people cast them as Muslims all the time.
I also think, to play devil's advocate to your point, our land was stolen generations ago. There are Palestinians living who remember their houses being taken, whose houses are still standing with all their stuff in it. There's Jewish families living in. So I do think that I have empathy. Like, the situation is different.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it also suggests that, now is the time to fix this. Now is instead of waiting 300 years and being like, okay, well, nothing can be done now, there's millions of you there, that there needs to be some kind of a resolution for this traumatizing dislocation and violence that's been inflicted on people.
So was there anything that you wish we'd talked more about?
Honestly, I would have liked to have talked more about the historical roots of anti-Semitism and the fact that Christianity kind of invented it. If you look at so much of the discourse that developed in the Middle Ages around demonizing the Jewish people, the repeated pogroms, the repeated expulsion of Jewish people from Christian communities, the reason why Jewish people got involved in banking and got involved in Hollywood was because of Jewish people being systemically barred from so many spaces. And I honestly do feel like that's just something that we have to have a conversation about, and that the protection of the dignity of the Palestinian people kind of depends on it too. We can't keep on trying to atone for anti-Semitism by neglecting the Palestinian people.
I think mine was kind of the opposite in that I wanted to talk more about the future and what happens next. I think it was Jordan who said something about Pope Leo, and that something about how, as an American, he might be working from this framework of having two sides in conflict, and it's one side against the next, and any solution has to take into account that it's two sides in conflict. And I was interested in kind of teasing out like what that meant more, and what the alternatives were. And I think we learned a lot about Jordan and Julie's work and where they're coming from and kind of where we are today as a society. But we didn't really get like too much into into what their book is about, which is Catholic social teaching. They kind of laid out the framework and why it was important. And I feel like I always have this kind of like constructive bent, and I wanted to talk more about what that was, what was in the book, what arguments hadn't been made before, and kind of how that might lead to thinking or acting differently.
Maybe on some level, because we've gotten so used to thinking it's hopeless, that conversation about the future is one that maybe some of us are kind of psychologically resisting. Like, we don't want to sound utopian, but I don't know, maybe we should try to sound utopian. Maybe we should stop talking about it as though it's hopeless. I think something that came up in the conversation was that, religious extremism and nationalism are always bad, and obstacles to any better solution. And yet, religious extremism and nationalism have been overcome before, and it can happen again. And the major world religions that are involved here all have templates for peacemaking and respecting human dignity. And I don't know, I'm not inclined to be hopeful or optimistic, but wouldn't that be wild to just decide to be and see if a better discourse, a better language could lead to better action? I don't know.
Well, I feel like you're getting into our final question, which is, what would your sermon be?
My sermon would be, even though we are accustomed to living with a certain degree of hopelessness, perhaps, history has shown us over and over and over again that even though sometimes efforts towards justice and peace fail, sometimes also they work. And we are called to be God's hands in this world and to do that justice work, even when it seems futile. How about you?
I've been thinking a lot about trauma lately and what it means to believe in the resurrection, in an eschatological future, when you are in the midst of suffering trauma in its psychological definition. And I think I would want to kind of reflect and apply that to what's going on in Palestine and Israel. Does understanding the situation through the lens of what trauma does to people, what it does to their belief systems and their faith, how does that affect how we think about both the geopolitics of it and how to respond as individuals to individuals?
And that's our show. Thanks again for joining us for Glad You Asked. If you enjoyed the episode, please tell your friends about the podcast or leave us a review or rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It helps more people find our podcast.
Do you have a question you'd like to hear answered on our show? email us at editors@uscatholic.org. And please join us next week when we talk about whether sex is necessary in Catholic marriages.
Before we wrap up, we're excited to share a new ministry for immigrants and anyone impacted by forced migration. This ministry is led by our sponsors, the Claretian Missionaries. Somos, Together We Are Faith, Hope, and Strength, is a social media campaign offering spiritual care and resources for immigrants on their journey. Find us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Help us spread the word and support the migrant community. To learn more, visit claretians.org.
Glad You Asked is hosted by me, Emily Sana, along with Rebecca Bratton-Weiss. We're produced by Stephanie Clary and Joki Mercuria, with sound engineering by Nathaniel Hunter and art by Megan Avery.